So as Pastor Daniel has suggested, we're making a transition today to a 3 or 4 week study on the figure of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you're not familiar with Bonhoeffer, our goal here is to give you a broad summary of his life and then talk about some of the significant issues in Bonhoeffer's life that would be, shall we say, helpful for us in reflecting on what it means to be a Christian or live a Christian life in the modern, or as some would put it, a postmodern era. Now, why not let's just read the Bible? Well, we could, but we do that almost every week. And if you know, and I'm sure you do, in the ancient church, it was a commonplace for the church to reflect on the lives of people who had followed Christ in a profound way. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a figure who, in the modern sense, serves as an example who lived a Christian life in relationship to the time and culture in which he lived, that is exemplary for us to think about and reflect on and meditate about, because it's precisely people like Bonhoeffer who serve as living teachers to us. And so I want to spend the next 45 minutes introducing and talking about Bonhoeffer as an important Christian figure. And as we have this conversation, please feel free to ask questions. The whole point of this class is to ask questions, not to sit and listen to me ramble on and on and on. So if something comes to your mind that's important, you'd like to share, please do so. This is not a lecture class. It's meant to be a discussion class. And so we're going to discuss this figure, Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer grew up in the first half of the 20th century. He was born in 1906 in Germany. But he grew up initially in a part of Germany that was the old Prussia and is today in Poland. But he grew up the earliest part of his life in Prussia and moved at the age of 6 years old to Berlin. Well, Berlin was the capital, it was the cultural center, it was the intellectual center, it was the scientific center, it was the center of almost all things modern in the early 20th century. And so Bonhoeffer moves there at the age of 6 because his father, who was a professor of psychology in a university in Prussia, has now been called to the most prestigious chair, the most prestigious position in all of Germany as a professor of psychology. Now, not only did his father receive this appointment, he also ran a separate institution associated with his research and work that allowed them to receive money internationally. In other words, he got resources from other parts of the world for that research center that he was leading. And as a consequence, Bonhoeffer's family avoided some of the worst of the ups and downs of the economy in the early part of the 20th century. As you can remember, Germany was going through a very, very difficult time, runaway inflation, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were able to ride out a lot of the other social ills connected with having money. And so he grew up in a middle-class family, kind of upper middle-class family. was engaged in all the pursuits that an upper middle class family life would permit, music, sports, you name it. In other words, he didn't have to go to the factory and work. I mean, he lived a very comfortable life, received an excellent German education, and in those days, that was a pretty impressive education. And he grew up in a family of 8 children. He and his twin sister were the 6th and 7th children of 8. And his brothers had largely gone into law or engineering. But Dietrich chose pretty early on in his life to study theology. And this was odd. This made him a bit of an odd individual within his own family and his own social circle. And the reason is because in the upper middle class circles that Bonhoeffer's family trafficked, religiosity, the church, was essentially, how shall I say, quaint. It really was, it was perceived as being antiquated and not terribly with it. If this were the 60s, you would have described it as not very hip, not up with the times. And it was an institution that had its place for some people, but well-educated, well-heeled, upper middle class folks in early 20th century Germany did not need anything the church was offering, okay? Now, his mother was the daughter of a pastor, and she did dutifully with her children. Every night they would pray together before they went to bed. But you might say that that's kind of the end of it for them in terms of their religious upbringing. Mother would pray with them, and if they were going to have a baptism, get this now, if it was going to be a family baptism or some religious rite, they would often do these semi-secular rites. They would do them at the home. In other words, let's get a guy in to do that, like a plumber. They treated the clergy like plumbers. Just get a guy in to do that for us. So he's in this family that's semi-religious at best, and he chooses to pursue theology. And some people would venture that part of that was just to distinguish himself from his brothers. But it was obvious that he was quite serious about it as time went on. He would go on to study theology at a very, very advanced level. And because his family had money, he was able to travel. And so he would go to places like London and Rome and the United States. He was in New York to pursue his theological interests. Now, before I talk about the impact of that leisure or that capacity to travel, I should say something about the church into which Bonhoeffer would find himself. So church life in the United States is what? Primarily Roman Catholic and Protestant, broadly Protestant. And under the Protestant banner, you've got what? Well, you've got Presbyterians, and you've got Episcopalians, and you've got Lutherans, and you've got Anglicans, and you've got Baptists, and you've got what? Methodists, and Mennonites, and Brethren, and Nazarenes, and I mean, we've just got a plethora, shall we say, of different Protestant variations. Well, the church in Germany at this time, in the early part of the 20th century, it had considerable variety as well. I mean, you had the Roman Catholic community, which was primarily in the southern part of Germany. And then you had what's called the Free Church, which were the Baptists and the Methodists and the Mennonites You had the Free Church. But the church that Bonhoeffer would land in is the Protestant church. And the German Protestant church was made up primarily of 28 different churches. So when I say church, I mean kind of like for Baptist, we have, I don't know, the Baptist General Association of Virginia, that group of Baptists. Well, there were 28 different groups of Protestants who were not Free Church. They were largely connected to either the Reformed, the Lutheran, or some combination of that church. And the one that Bonhoeffer was connected to was the largest. It kind of represented, some of these Protestant bodies were very small and only identified with a small city, for example. Come on in, guys. But others were others could be quite large, in the millions. And the church that Bonhoeffer became a part of was 20 million. It was the old Prussian Empire church. And that church was a united church. United meaning that the Reformed tradition and the Lutheran tradition had been brought under one umbrella, and they were called the United Church. So Bonhoeffer is associated with a church that, shall we say, has influences both from the Lutheran tradition and the Reformed or Calvinist tradition. Both of these streams are in his churchly background. But the primary influence for Bonhoeffer was Lutheran. In other words, he was drawn to Luther more than to Calvin, Zwingli, or Bucer. And that becomes significant in ways down the line that we'll talk about later. But it's important to know that this is the church that he finds himself in. And this church, like all the churches, are going to find themselves in some tension. Not to put it mildly, but some tension between themselves and the state. I want to jump back and go back to his travels as a young man pursuing theology. Like I said, he goes to Rome, he goes to London, he goes to the United States. Let's talk about his visit to the United States. So Bonhoeffer, in his education, goes to Union Theological Seminary in New York in the United States. And Union Theological Seminary is close to Harlem. And he meets a guy named Fisher, who brings him to the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City. Well, if you've ever been there, boy, can they worship. And Bonhoeffer, this uptight German Lutheran theologian, encounters a predominantly African-American Baptist church in New York. And it blows his mind. It blows his mind. He is so captivated by the way faith makes its presence known in that fellowship. You know, everything from the youth club to the Bible studies to the worship, you name it, Bonhoeffer is soaking all of this up. And this is the first time, remember, he comes from an upper middle class, prominent family. His daddy holds the highest chair as a professor of psychology in the country at Berlin University, or the University of Berlin. So he's lived his whole life extremely comfortably in Germany. And this is the first time in his life that he has spent time, prayed with, lived with, understood what it means to be in a fellowship of Christians who are predominantly marginalized by the wider community, by the wider society. These folks worship differently, they speak differently, they sing differently. He's so impressed with the music that he hears emanating from these souls at Abyssinian Baptist Church, that he buys albums. And he takes these albums back to Germany and plays them for his seminary students who are, they're equally blown away by what they're hearing. And so he spent time in New York. And this will be important because not only is this the first time that he's met folks who are, shall we say, on the back end of society's interests. That will become very important to him as he returns to Germany, and when Hitler comes to power, the way in which what the state is doing is oppressing the Jews in Germany. So that spiritual connection is made. It's also important to know that he met a French pacifist Christian in New York while he was there, who had an influence on him in the sense that this particular French intellect advocated for a version or a form of Christianity that expressed its allegiance to Christ in a manner that would strike many people as radical. And what do I mean by that? Radical in the sense that Jesus comes first and nothing else, even if that puts you in conflict with your own nation state. You have to go with Jesus before you go with anybody else. And of course, Bonhoeffer had grown up in a world where, the pastors got their paycheck from the state. That's just the way the system worked. So he's learning from this pacifist about how you can't be a Christian and a nationalist. Those two things can't be in the same space at the same time. You can't be a Christian and a nationalist. You can't have a first allegiance, shall we say, to the nation state and a second allegiance to Jesus. That won't work. So these are the two big influences that he encounters in New York at the Union Theological Seminary. He also finds himself in London, 1933 to 1935, and I won't go too deep into this, but it's important to note that there he meets a bishop, Bishop Bell, who will be an important figure in his efforts to resist the Nazis in time. And we'll talk about that later. Yes, ma'am?
But the bishop would be with the Roman Catholic.
No, he was an Anglican bishop. Anglican bishop, because he's in London.
Yeah.
And so this is the early part of his life. And as I said before, he finds himself increasingly and closely aligned with Lutheran doctrine. So it's important to take a minute and remind ourselves of what's at the heart of this doctrine. Well, you might say it's the heart of Protestantism. Because as you remember, Martin Luther was the first protester. He was the first radical Protestant reformer, calling for what would become a radical departure from the norm. And part of Luther's theology will influence how one understands the relationship between the church and the state. Now, you remember that there are several things that characterize this early Reformation. This is in the 16th century, the middle 1500s. All this is breaking. Luther, 1517, puts his thesis on the door in the church in Wittenberg, right? So the Reformation's underway. And three or four things that are central to that reforming work is the idea that sola scriptura, Scripture alone, that's the source of, that's our primary source of understanding God, right? Sola Christus. Solus Christus means Christ alone. Christ comes first above anything else in your life. Sola gratia. It's only by God's grace that you're saved. Sola fide. It's only by faith that we experience the grace of God and hang on to that grace that God has given us, that we hear about through preaching and through the Scriptures that point to this Christ who is the pinnacle of our allegiance. So these are Lutheran doctrines. They're really Protestant doctrines. They're doctrines that we all, as Protestants, have embraced, and they have implications. And one of the implications is, as I suggested earlier, what Lutheran teaches about the relationship between the church and the state. And it's this concept of two kingdoms. And, you know, one kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. The other kingdom is a political, or whatever you want to call it, worldly kingdom. And worldly authorities have their job, their role before God, and spiritual kingdom has its responsibility, its leaders and its institutions before God. Which means if it's two kingdoms, right, this kingdom doesn't get to tell that kingdom what to do. And if this kingdom tries to tell that kingdom what to do, what do they have to do? They have to resist. So the state cannot tell the church what it must do in order to undertake its spiritual responsibilities, and vice versa, because these are separate authorities under God. There is a secular authority and there's a spiritual authority. And this is a Lutheran doctrine that plays heavily into how Bonhoeffer will take up the difficulties that he's facing. Now, I don't want to go all the way into the things that took place from 33 on, because in 33, what happens? What happens in 1933? Hitler comes to power as the chancellor. He's appointed as chancellor of Germany. And what does he do? He and his party decide to bring the entire country under the, shall we say, organizational, programmatic auspices of the Nazi Party. In other words, there are all these institutions. And it's interesting what they're aiming to do. Every organization, schools, walking groups, what we would call Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, all the institutions in the society have to demonstrate their programmatic, shall we say, allegiance or connection to Nazi ideology. And, of course, this impacts the church. All these churches have to come under the auspices, in a sense, of the Nazi Party. And, of course, this isn't going to be easily done. Now, Hitler grew up Catholic, so he understood that game. Catholicism is a top-down organization, so you fix the top, you got the rest, right? So they were able to create a kind of concordat between the state and the Roman Church in the South. And once that was done, Hitler didn't have to worry about the Catholic Church anymore. Well, now he's got the Protestant Church up north, and he's got to deal with them, and millions of them. Well, what he wanted to do, what he aims to do, is take all of these disparate 28 organizations, churches, and he wants to put them under one bishop. He wants to, the kind of the Reich bishop, and put him at the top of the church. So everything that follows, there's influence flows from there into all these churches, and then you can control them and modify them and shape them in a way that reflects Nazi ideology. Yes, please.
Yeah, how Hitler get power? Did the church vote for him?
How did Hitler get power? He was elected. The answer to your question is yes. The church voted for him. Almost everybody did. Now, that is a beautiful question. Thank you. Yeah, the church voted for him. And here's where the difficulties begin for everyone. Because the church, let's just stay with the Protestant church right now. But the Protestant church, with these developments, begins to divide. And you have the German church, the German Protestants, but then you have the confessing church, those who are going, now wait a minute, right? They're all going, now wait a minute, you can't do that. But this is where it gets really sticky. Hitler wasn't in power very long before he handed down what might be described as an administrative dictate. I think it's called the, the Aryan, what's it called? I think I got a note on it somewhere. It's the Aryan something. Called the Aryan paragraph. Hitler did not require the Aryan paragraph. What Hitler required was an administrative rule that meant if you work in the civil service of the German government, that you had to demonstrate that you had 4 German parents, or grandparents is what it means. You had to have 4 German grandparents. And if any one of the 4 was not German, i.e. they were Jewish, then you're out. You can't be in the you can't work for the government. You can't be a civil servant. John?
It's just a curious family thing. My family was in Germany. My uncle worked for the German National Bank. And so we've got this elaborate family tree that he had to pay for to take to the authorities to keep his job.
Right, to demonstrate that he had 4 German grandparents. So, in other words, if you weren't Aryan, you couldn't work for the government. Well, back to my comment earlier, what happens to a pastor who doesn't have 4 German parents, who gets his paycheck from the state? He got a problem. So, in other words, the Nazis were slowly and systematically weeding out from the upper echelons of society anyone who had Semitic roots. And they were very effective at it. Now, here's the thing. The German church, German Protestants, they were broadly sympathetic to Hitler. Let me repeat that. The German Protestant church was broadly sympathetic to Hitler. I mean, after all, the trains are running on time. Right? He's getting stuff done. He's passing legislation. He's thumbing his nose at the French, which is always fun. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. I have a British wife, so these things happen. No, I mean, he was attractive to them. He was a strong man. He was going to make changes. He was going to bring Germany back to its former glory. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. There are all kinds of reasons that people voted for him.
And it's early on.
It's very early on. Very early on. But then they start to once they're in power, they start to control the administration of the state. And the administration of the state influences So the church now, the confessing church, the minority pastors who are a little concerned about all this, there's what's called the Arian paragraph. Are they going to include that in their rules for being a pastor? Well, not even everyone in the confessing church was against this. I mean, some of them in the confessing church are going, well, do we really want Jewish people as pastors of our churches? I mean, these were Jewish Christians. Yeah, who were pastors there? Do we really want these people as pastors? You know, they're thinking about this. They're actually thinking about this hard. And these are the ones protesting. Which means that there's just this small minority of protesting German Christians who were going, have you lost your mind? Well, Bonhoeffer was among those who were just wagging his head going, guys, come on. We cannot put the Arian paragraph in our rules for what it means to be a pastor in Germany. Remember who you are. Who do you follow first? Christ. Not the Führer. And remember, these are early days. But there's a lot of tension. Yes, sir.
I think it's very important for us to reflect on this. Why did Hitler come to power and my country, why Mussolini came to power?
Absolutely.
They were deceived, the church was deceived. What were the warning signs? They both had an ideology based on violence, based on prevarication, and I think Hitler also, since early on, because they were early on, but since early on, he started going not against the Jews. The first target were the disabled, the terminally sick,
That's right.
the elderly, very poor people.
Right.
He went very heavily against them with measures which he had an ideology of what do you call
Eugenics.
eugenics.
That's right. You're absolutely right. He started with the ones everybody was against. Even the Jews are against it.
A Christian shouldn't miss, but
Right.
in spite of that, they were deceived, and we have to work to reflect on this because we could be deceived in the same way. We should not.
Absolutely.
We should be better than them.
No. Absolutely. You know, there was a broad, almost worldwide ideology that suggested that if we bred people up the right way, we wouldn't have, you know, people with disabilities and people who have, you know, mental problems. And John.
And you're saying one of our greatest Supreme Court justices, Oliver Wendell Holmes,
Yes.
wrote a landmark case making eugenics and sterilization of what we call infected people the law in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened in the 20s, I think, 20 to more years before Hitler took power. So Pastor Jeff was just saying this worldwide idea. We had it here too.
Oh yeah, the United States was deeply influenced by the eugenics movement. The early part of the 20th century, it was not uncommon to sterilize people, to do lobotomies, to pursue all kinds of experiments on human beings towards a kind of utopian view of humanity. And the Nazis, of course, they were strong believers in this. Now, why were they believers in it? Well, because it fed or underwrote, with this kind of pseudoscience, it underwrote their other ideological commitments, which had to do with their own racial superiority. This was an effort to scientifically demonstrate their own racial superiority. Yes, sir.
We don't have much time, but this whole idea is no longer unique. You know, and I like what you said, that it was a worldwide idea.
Oh, yeah.
In Africa, for example, kids were born and they were not they looked sickly, there was a way of getting rid of them.
Right.
All right. Now, it wasn't very common, but it was then.
Yeah.
And it was all part of this movement.
Right.
So I just want to affirm that it was something that was on there.
Right. So I'm going to say one more thing, and then I want to open it up for questions because I do want us to have time for discussion. So when Bonhoeffer is writing, because he was a prolific writer, He wrote, prayers and plays and poetry and books that are considered classics in ethics, all of which have had a significant influence on the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century. But one of the concepts that he proffered was this notion of the world come of age. Bonhoeffer is there in Germany looking at the radical decline of religiosity in Europe. And he's saying that there's this idea among people that there really isn't any need for God anymore. And the church has become a redundant entity. It doesn't work for us anymore. Having come of age means that human beings really have no need for God. So you'll hear conversation or talk around that a little bit. He was also influenced rather significantly by a theologian whose name is Karl Barth. Karl Barth was a Swiss German-speaking theologian who had also been a prolific writer and figure and was part of a movement called the dialectical movement. And I'll say just a minute about that. But Barth's relationship to the German hierarchy was in significant tension because Barth had rejected the German church's rationale for supporting the German state during the First World War. In other words, the German state decides to go to war, and all the German churches just go right along with them. Say, oh, that's great. We ought to go do that. We ought to have this war, and give rationale for it. And Barth was strongly against this in the First World War. And so this dialectical movement that Barth initiated was that Barth was trying to remind people that God says no to your religiosity, because your religiosity is blinding you to the sinful reality of your choices to pursue violence in your own interest. And so God says no to that, but yes to Jesus, yes to Christ. And we have to give ourselves to saying yes to Christ first. And so this was influential for Bonhoeffer. So he's trying to speak into a world where European religiosity is in collapse. The credibility of the church is weak. Those who are in the church seem to be going along with whatever the state wants to do and celebrating it. Saying that, what the politics of our day are advocating, we're all for it. We're right behind them. We want to be a part of that. And that sets up a story about a man who, for us, would be considered a modern martyr. It sets up a situation where Bonhoeffer finds himself ultimately working within the intelligence community of the German war machine, but he is working with other figures within that unit to assassinate Hitler. And of course, this raises all kinds of profound questions about the justification for pursuing Hitler's assassination and what it means as a Christian to pursue violence in the interest of justice, and on and on and on. But Bonhoeffer, as you're probably aware, was ultimately, after the plot there were many, many plots to assassinate Hitler, but one came very close. And Bonhoeffer was considered to be associated with that plot. And 2 weeks before the camp that he was in 1945 was liberated, Hitler said, I want him executed. And they executed him. So Bonhoeffer was executed at the age of 39 for conspiracy to assassinate the Fuhrer. So there's the lead up to 1933, and next week we're going to talk about a lot of what this means, what this is about, what's going on, and how does this Christian, this young German theologian, against what you might call a tsunami of opposition, how does he stand as a Christian over against all of that? What does he say that gives life to his words so that Christians today go, that's a man who followed Christ? Right? So questions or comments at this point?
I don't actually have a question because I've read Bonhoeffer, and I am just so thankful that you're teaching it. This book right here, if anybody wants to take a look, there's pictures here. It might be something you either want to borrow from me or order on Amazon. I can't say enough.
Downstairs in the library.
And it's downstairs in the library. I can't say enough. This man is incredible, and I would only like to wish that I could, to follow in his footsteps, and it's at the time he was. And you're absolutely right how Hitler was about the paragraph. In my family, my stepfather's grandfather was forced to change his name from a Jewish name to Gerber.
Right.
So it would sound German. So there's just so much history that not only affected the Jews, but just the Germans in general. So just want to point that out. But
All
you're
right.
welcome to the book.
Ed?
I was just impressed with the fact that all this happened to him before he was even 30 years old.
Oh, yeah.
I thought you said he was born in 06.
Right.
By 33, he's
Right.
in his late 20s.
Yeah, Dr. King was 39 when he died, and you looked at all that went on with him and all the work that he did in his late 20s and early 30s that was so significant. Bonhoeffer similarly. Yes?
Yeah, I truly believe all these eugenics always in history worked as devil's plan to eliminate mankind because we are from God.
From God, right.
That's why they hate us. Even today is greater than I think that Hitler times.
Yeah.
So today is happening worse than Nazi times. But in history, we have also similar story in Korea.
Right.
Because North Korea and South Korea we separated. Before, North Korea was like a revived church.
Mm-hmm.
So many pastors came out, and it was like a field of Holy Spirit. What happened there? And then Japanese came.
Yeah.
They invited Korea, and then all the pastors who, loved God, they get along with the Japanese. So they bow down before the Japanese God.
Right.
They put inside the church and made them bow down
Right.
to the statues, and all they bow down. So one Korean pastor, only one Korean pastor, resisted him, murdered him everywhere.
Wow.
So always there are people who God, spirit-filled people, God will give us this strength to stand up to this evil.
Excellent. Thank you. Roger?
Oh, I was just going to say, Jesus had some trouble in his early 30s.
That's good. I like that. Yes, just a little bit. All right, John's going to be the last comment, and then we've got a break.
I was just going to say about the church next week. We're going to
Yeah.
take late 1930, 34. You're going to find that one of the most prominent theologians in the world wrote the German purity laws of 1935 and was actually the author of the Holocaust. And it was a famous pastor, Christian theologian, Gerhard Kippel.
Right.
So the church is deeply, deeply embedded in this evil.
Right. So just hold on to your hats, as they say. All right. Thank you. Let's go to worship.